Good morning. Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Free Press Media Press Inc., an alternative parties books publisher, sponsors this podcast. I'm Andrew Bouchard. Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today, friends, we have a guest who is an expert in one of our favorite topics on this podcast. He's an expert in ballot access. We talk about that again and again through the interviews with nonpartisan reform organizations as well as candidates running for alternative party offices. It's a thing that we can't get around. It's very important to get this right. So his name is Richard Winger. He is with Ballot Access News, and he has been active in this space for a long time, and he's done a lot of great things for our cause. So welcome to the podcast, Richard.
Okay, thanks for having me.
We're glad to have you. Richard, if you could please start by kindly giving us an introduction to yourself, a brief biographical sketch.
Well, I was born in California in 1943, and I went to the University of California at Berkeley, and I got very interested in ballot access, even as a freshman, and I've never stopped being interested in it. And it's a terrible thing that when it comes to the right of voters to vote for the candidate of their choice, it's very sad to say this country has gone backwards.
Oh, no.
In the 19th century, there were many, many restrictions in voting, and we've cleared them away over the years. Generally, election rights have improved in this country over the last 200 years, but in the one area of freedom to vote for who you want, that has declined. And now we are in the same league with Russia and Iran.
Alas.
And other democratic countries simply do not do what we do. They make it easy for new parties and new candidates to get on the ballot. That's not true of us.
Alas. I hear Howie Hawkins talk about that. He says in New York that it's stricter than Putin's Russia. So he says he wants them to get at least to Putin's standards. So that's interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I think in the last Russian presidential election, as I recall, there were 4 candidates on the ballot for president of Russia. And in New York, we'll probably just have 3 and possibly just 2.
Oh, no.
In fact, New York is probably the only state where the Libertarian presidential nominee won't be on the ballot this year.
Oh, no. Oh, no. The Libertarians are very good about, they're very on the ball and they're very active, so that's very sad.
Well, in 2019 and again in 2020, the New York legislature just wrecked ballot access. In 2019, they moved the petition deadline from August to May, so you can no longer count on going out to summer festivities like July 4th and Memorial Day, because you have to have got the petitions all done. Then in 2020, they tripled the number of signatures needed for a statewide minor party or independent candidate, and they did not expand the narrow 6-week petitioning period. And they changed the definition of a party and took the Libertarian and Green and Independence parties off the ballot.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
We're still trying to defeat some of these changes in court. We still have one case pending in the Second Circuit. It concerns the change from the deadline from August to May. So I just wish that case could win. It could happen any day now. We'll just, when the court puts out its decision, we'll see what it is, hope for the best.
Sure. Is it the Libertarian Party filing it, or is it Green Party filing it, or who's filing it?
This is filed by the mayor of Buffalo when he lost the primary. Then he petitioned as an independent. The petition had enough signatures, but they still disallowed it because he violated the new deadline. So that's what he's suing over. Ironically, he got reelected that November anyway as a write-in.
Oh, interesting.
His name is Byron Brown.
Okay, so it's good that even though he won, it's still a matter of principle that it's getting through for the rest of us.
Right. These kind of cases keep going even after the election's over because there's an exception for mootness for ballot access cases.
Yeah, that's right. I remember reading that in the cases. So I'm interested in this. I asked one of our interviewees was a socialist, and he was saying that one of the reasons they got these restrictions on ballot access was due to the Red Scare, to want to get the socialist candidates off the ballot. Do you think that was the main cause, or why do you see that they're accelerating the restrictions, like you mentioned at the top of the show?
Well, I was very surprised to learn when I researched the history of the ballot access laws, the absolute worst period for making these laws stricter came in 1969 and 1971.
Huh.
It was a reaction to George Wallace running as an independent for president in 1968.
Oh,
One
okay.
third of the states made their laws significantly more difficult in the 4 years after the 1968 election. I should start by saying before the 1892 presidential election, there were no ballot access restrictions at all because there were no government printed ballots. Every voter was free to make his or her own ballot, but most voters just got a ballot from their favorite party, and if they didn't want to vote a straight ticket, they could cross off some of the names and write in others. So there was no such thing as a declaration of candidacy, no such thing as a filing fee, no such thing as a petition. There was no way the government could keep anybody from running for office, and no way the government could stop anybody from voting for anybody he or she wanted. So that was the 19th century, and we had perfect freedom, and it worked fine. But nowadays, it's different. And there's been a lot of bad changes just in the last few years. I hate to say it, and I'm not partisan, but I have to tell the truth here. The laws making ballot access more restrictive have been passed by Democratic majority state legislatures.
Yuck.
Like just last year, Minnesota, the Democratic majority passed a law increasing the vote test for a party to meet the definition of a qualified party, and they raised it from 5% to 8%. And they did that to get rid of the legal marijuana now party.
Yeah, I saw that in your latest newsletter. You mentioned that they were unfortunately off the ballot.
Yeah, and the Democratic majority in Nevada made Nevada ballot access harder 2 years ago, and also New Mexico did the same thing.
So it's a bad trend all around.
It is, because these laws have been getting better in the 1990s. The 1990s was a great decade. Excuse me.
Oh, so now they're getting worse.
Right. In the last 2 years, they've gotten worse.
Okay. So would you say it ebbs and flows over history, that in some periods it gets better, then it gets worse, and then it gets better? Or is it a straight
Right.
down?
Well, generally speaking, they started out in the 1890s very easy. In fact, half the states let a new party in the ballot with no petition at all. You just had to turn in a list of your officers and your candidates. So they got worse and worse and worse without let up. And they especially got worse in 1969 and 1971. But then in the 1990s, they started getting better. And that's because the minor parties were talking to state legislators, trying to get them to ease up. And a lot of states made big improvements. So things were going very well in the 1990s. And then everybody remembers the 2000 presidential election, except really young people. And, of course, Ralph Nader was perceived as having caused Al Gore to lose, and so our progress slowed way down. And we still made some good changes in the 1910s, but the 2010s, but the 2020s have been pretty bad.
Oh, no. Okay, that's interesting how that ebbs and flows.
Oh, I'm sorry. That'll stop ringing after just 2 more rings.
Okay,
I'll
no
walk
worries.
away from it.
No worries. No worries. It's all good. So at the top of the show, you also mentioned that you compared us to other countries, and you're saying that unfortunately we're one of the worst that we compare with Iran and Russia. So do you also pay attention to international politics as a way to understand our politics better and to learn stuff maybe we could apply to our
So,
system?
somewhat. There's a really good book that has the ballot access laws of all the democratic countries of the world,
Oh,
and I have that. I'll just mention the two countries that I consider closest to us are Canada and Great Britain. In Great Britain, anybody can get on the ballot for House of Commons with 10 signatures and £500, and they get
oh
their money
my.
back if they get 5%. In Canada, anybody can get on the ballot for House of Commons if they have 100 signatures and a filing fee of 1,000 Canadian dollars, and again, they get their money back if they get 5%. So parties like the Green Party in Great Britain and Canada regularly appear on the ballot in every single district.
Oh wow.
Because it's just not a problem, and everybody takes it for granted. And whereas you might think the Labour Party in Great Britain would try to keep the Green Party off the ballot, they don't.
Huh.
They just wouldn't think of such a thing. They would think that was wrong and immoral. And same way in Canada, you don't see the Liberal Party trying to keep the New Democratic Party off the ballot.
Hmm.
And in fact, the United States and a bunch of other democratic countries signed the document of the Copenhagen meeting of the conference of the CSCE in 1990. And we and all the other countries, we promised to respect the right of citizens to seek political or public office individually or as representative of political parties without discrimination.
Hmm.
And we just ignore that.
Alas. So what's that book called? I didn't hear about that book before.
It's not a book, it's a treaty.
No, I'm sorry. You said a book that listed all the ballot access laws.
Yeah. Oh, sure. That was written by 3 Canadian political scientists. I've got the book up in my books in my bedroom, but I can't remember
Okay.
the name of the book right now.
That's okay. That sounds interesting.
But I remember the lead author. His name is Antoine Yoshi
Okay, that's
Mira.
helpful. Okay, that's helpful. Okay, wow. So do you think we should go back to the way it was in the 1890s, or do you think that would be too impractical these days because of more population and other factors? So do you want to go back to that standard, or do you think we should reform it to some extent, yet not quite that far?
The latter. I mean, you're right. We have a lot more people than we did back then. I'm not in favor of moderate requirements like the British and the Canadians.
Okay.
But here's the absolute worst ballot access law in the whole country. It's Georgia.
Oh, no.
Georgia in 1943 said unless your party had pulled 20% of the vote for president in the entire country, meaning only the Democrats and Republicans, you cannot run for U.S. House of Representatives unless you do a petition signed by 5% of all the registered voters in the district, which in the typical district is about 27,000 signatures. This law has existed since 1943, 81 years. And in 81 years, no minor party candidate has ever been able to do it. And plenty have tried. The trouble is, if you go out in the street with a petition for U.S. House, only people who live in that district can sign. Well, the lines are very wiggly and complicated, and the overwhelming majority of people do not know what congressional district they live in. They might know who their congressperson is, but they don't know the number and they don't know the boundaries of it.
Yeah.
So inevitably you get a lot of well-meaning people that want to help you out. They sign your petition, and then you turn it in, and a bunch of the signers don't live in the district. So even if you turn in double, 50,000, which is an incredible job, it'll be no good. That's what's happened time after time. And we got the law declared unconstitutional a few years ago, but then the 11th Circuit reversed it. And
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but I'm going to say some judges are really prejudiced because we got a panel with the former Attorney General of Alabama and the former Solicitor General of Georgia. These judges, in their minds, they're loyal to the state government, and they will not strike down an unfair election law because they don't want to go against their own state's laws. And they even said, and this is ridiculous, they said in their opinion, states have a compelling interest in keeping people off the ballot unless they're strong enough to win. They didn't cite any precedent for that. They just made it up.
Yeah.
But the Supreme Court wouldn't take the case, so we're stuck with it.
So here's a question for you. One of the arguments people have when they're running candidates is they'll say that ballot access requirements are needed because you don't want everyone on the ballot. You don't want to be like California that year when they had all those candidates on the ballot and Arnold Schwarzenegger won. So how would you respond to that? Would you say that that's not a valid argument, or you think there should be some basic requirements but not quite as strict, or how would you respond to that?
The year you're talking about, there were 135 candidates for governor on the ballot. You're absolutely right. That was terrible. It was very hard on the voters to find the candidate they wanted to vote for. But California only required 65 signatures. I recommend 5,000 signatures. I've studied this. Any
5,000,
state
wow.
that requires at least more than 5,000 will never have a crowded ballot. I've proved that historically.
Oh.
In the whole history of government ballot access laws, except for 3 times in New York State, there's never been a state that had more than 8 candidates on the ballot for single office if they required more than 5,000. So it works. 5,000 would solve the problem. And I don't think 8 candidates for single office is so many that it confuses anybody. In fact, I copied that number 8 from the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Harlan said in a concurrence that he didn't think 8 candidates was a problem. So that's where I'd set it, 5,000 signatures.
Okay. That sounds reasonable. Interesting. So you said you looked at the history of it and you did some analysis, statistical analysis to show that that number would be the optimal number to prevent the ballot crowding the extreme case that happened in California.
Right. I published it. It's in a scholarly publication.
Oh wow, interesting. What's the name of the publication?
Fordham Law Journal. Fordham is a law school in New York State.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
I'll send it to anybody that wants a copy. I have a whole bunch of copies left over. I don't know if you want to let me say my email address now, but
oh sure, if you want to, that's fine. Just go ahead, sir.
Okay, it's my name all run together with no dot. So it's Richard Winger at yahoo.com. And everybody knows how to spell Richard, and Winger is just like Winger, like left winger, right winger. So again,
like
Richard
the band.
Winger. Yeah, Richard Winger at yahoo.com. Yeah, like the band.
Okay,
and it was
sounds good. Do you remember about access? I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Do you remember a ballot access case where, I believe it was in Illinois, they had a requirement you couldn't have a party with a similar name. And there's a lot of parties that have socialists in their name, so it was any part of the name, it wouldn't be like 2 Democratic parties. There's a Socialist Equality Party, and there's a Socialist Party. So the Socialist Equality Party got with the Socialist Party. They said, we have our differences, yet the Socialist Party says it's okay for us to use the name. So they used whatever the first one had to be. That was the one that got it. Do you remember that case?
Yeah, but it was in Oregon.
Oregon, okay.
And it was, let's see, it was the Socialist Party and, I'm trying to remember what the other one was, but
I think it was Socialist Equality Party.
no, it wasn't. It was the, well, I'm I'm mad at myself. But anyway, you're definitely right. It was a party with socialist in its name. There's been several cases like that. There was one in Pennsylvania too, where the Socialist Labor Party and the Socialist Workers Party got together and they said, we don't mind if each party gets to use its own name. So in almost all states now, there's no restriction that's that severe.
Well, that's good.
It's a little more flexible because you're right. There's been a lot of parties with socialist in their name. Oh, I remember the Oregon party. It was the Freedom Socialist Party.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, that sounds right, yeah.
It's a West Coast organization headquartered in Seattle.
Yeah, we interviewed them a long time ago on our podcast, so yeah, that's interesting.
Oh.
Yeah,
There's been the Socialist Party, the Socialist Labor Party, the Socialist Workers Party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and the Freedom Socialist Party. Yeah, there's been a lot.
Yeah, they all have different perspectives and different vibes. It's interesting.
Yeah, plus, there was the Workers' World Party and the Workers' League Party and the Socialist Equality Party. It's kind of like religion. They split and split and split.
Yep, very true. I also remember another case that was very egregious. That one I remember because that was very egregious. The other one was, I believe it was in Illinois, where they had a requirement in order to run for any office, something to the effect of your party had to have a candidate fielded in every other race in the district.
Yeah, that was Illinois. We got that law held unconstitutional.
Yes. Yep, I remember that. Because that was so absurd that the judges, they couldn't, no matter how biased or gung-ho about preserving the system they couldn't see any sense in that.
Yeah, we won 3-0 in the Seventh Circuit. We also won in the U.S. District Court.
Awesome.
We have won a lot of cases. In fact, every single state has had at least one ballot access law declared unconstitutional or enjoined.
Wow.
Unfortunately, sometimes the judges don't report the decision that we win. That means if anyone goes into a law library, one sees all these books that all look alike, and they contain copies of decisions of all kinds. It's called the Federal Supplement for the U.S. District Courts and the Federal Reporter for the U.S. Courts of Appeals. And if the judge sends in his or her decision to be put in those books, then it's much easier to use it as a good precedent. Unfortunately, we won a lot of cases and the judges didn't send them in to be reported, which is kind of irritating.
Yes, that's called published opinions versus unpublished opinions, right?
Right, exactly right, yeah.
Okay, so yes, that makes sense. Because the published ones are more, like you're saying, they're more easily to be deemed precedent because, and the unpublished ones, sometimes people invoke them, but it's a much harder argument to make in court than to have an unpublished argument as a precedent, an unpublished opinion.
And then you have to go to all the bother to attach it to your briefs, so the judge can read it.
So why do you think the judges aren't publishing those cases?
I don't know. I wish I did. There's been a few times in my life when I even wrote letters to judges and asked them to please report that case.
Oh, wow.
But there's only one time in my life when that worked.
Oh, good. At least it worked once.
That was an Arizona law where the legislature passed a law saying only independent voters could sign the petition for an independent candidate,
Hmm.
and that was struck down, but it wasn't reported, and so I asked the judge to report it, and he did.
Oh, wow. Good. Good. Interesting.
And we need that precedent because Louisiana passed the exact same law earlier this year.
Oh, wow.
So we'll have to, but it doesn't go into effect until 2026, so we'll probably have a lawsuit against it, and it'll be very helpful to cite that Arizona opinion, because those are the only two states that ever had a law like that, except for Oregon briefly, but then they repealed it.
Okay. So when you wrote these judges, you said one time that they agreed. If they didn't agree, did they bother to write you back, or what happened?
Oh no, they just, although I must admit, I have had 2 friendly letters from a Supreme Court justice.
Oh, wow.
And it made me feel good.
Oh, sure, yeah. That's a good idea. I never thought of that. So if we come across these cases, and they're not published, we could ask the judge to publish them.
Right.
Interesting. So what do you think when the alternative parties or the nonpartisan organizations go to court and are successful in challenging these laws? Do you think it's a matter of preparation on their side, or do you think sometimes it's the luck of the draw? They might have a law that it's so egregious that any reasonable mind would have to overturn it, or what do you think makes a successful ballot access case?
I hate to say it, it's really a sad thing, but the number one determinant of whether you win a ballot access constitutional case is what the characteristics of the judge are.
Oh,
All judges are human beings, just like all of us, and we all have feelings and prejudices and desires, and some judges just are oriented toward fairness and rationality, and some of them are just too part of their partisan makeup. They let their decisions be influenced by their partisan feelings. I'm sorry to say this, but the Minnesota Supreme Court this year did a terrible job, and they're all Democrats but one, and the Democratic Party sued the Minnesota Secretary of State to take the Legal Marijuana Now party off the ballot, and they upheld that.
yeah.
And it was they said the party should be removed from the ballot because it wasn't organized with the same structure that the law required. But the problem with that is, in 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court said in a California case, it's none of the government's business how a party is organized. That was won by the California Libertarian Party, and the law said the party had to run its affairs with county central committee members elected in each county, but the party didn't want to do it that way. The party had its own regions, dividing up California into more equal population areas, and the Supreme Court unanimously said, well, if the Libertarian Party wants to do it that way, that's fine. It's none of the government's business. So how could the Minnesota Supreme Court do what it did? They looked back to an earlier Supreme Court case that said in 1979, it told the Washington Democratic Party they had to have their state central committee had to be composed of 2 members from each county. And so you could say the 1989 Supreme Court decision wiped out the 1979 opinion, and it did. But the Minnesota Supreme Court just based their whole thing on the 1979 case and didn't consider the 1989 case. So that's the way it goes sometimes. And I must say that the judges in New York State that upheld the 2020 tripling of the number of signatures, they were pretty bad too. The U.S. District Court wouldn't even allow a trial, and he ruled the very next day after the hearing, and he didn't even understand the law. And then we went to the Second Circuit, and they issued a one-sentence opinion saying the U.S. District Court did nothing wrong. They didn't get into the merits of the case. It's like they didn't even read the briefs. So I'm venting here, and I wish they were listening.
Sure.
They probably aren't.
Yes. Yes. So it sounds like the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, they know what to do for filing a suit. If someone's involved in a minor party and they want to file a suit, what type of lawyer would they go to for that?
There's a few lawyers that specialize in ballot access. Unfortunately, there aren't enough of them. There's only about 5 or 6.
Oh, no.
And they have too much work.
Sure.
Especially this year. The Democrats are filing challenges to Robert Kennedy Jr.'s petitions in some states, and it's tying up the lawyers. You know, we don't have enough lawyers who care about this.
So there's a few that specialize in particular. So assuming that those wouldn't be available, what's the broader area of law that this would fall under?
Could you say it again?
Yes, because you said there's only a few of them and they are busy right now. What's the broader area of law this would fall under? Would it be considered constitutional law, or what type of law area would you consider under?
Constitutional law, especially First Amendment. And there are a lot of lawyers that do specialize in the First Amendment, so that's the kind of lawyer that naturally would be good at this.
Sure, freedom of association under the First Amendment.
Right. Yeah, because there is no explicit right to vote in the U.S. Constitution, which is unfortunate. So we have to kind of depend on the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment.
Okay. So do other countries have a specific explicit right to vote in their constitutions?
Oh, practically every democratic country does.
Oh, my.
Yeah. And a lot of the state constitutions do, too.
Oh, good for them, at least.
But unfortunately, they're not specific enough. There's a lot of states that have in their state constitution, elections shall be free and equal. And yet, state courts are frequently reluctant to apply it because it's kind of vague. Like, the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld extreme gerrymandering, and I think people know what gerrymandering is, and actually most people say gerrymandering, although technically you're supposed to say gerrymandering.
Oh, so we were pronouncing it wrong.
And so even though the North Carolina U.S. House districts have an extreme gerrymander, the state courts will not apply the free and equal law to do anything about it. So it's just a little too vague, and it would be better if the state constitutional right protecting voting rights were more explicit.
Sure.
You know, I was once introduced to some election observers from Mexico, and they said they were studying the U.S. election system, and they said that was most shocking to them was that election law and election administration in the United States is frequently under the jurisdiction of one party's official.
Oh, my.
Like a state board of elections or more likely a secretary of state. They were shocked. They thought any government body that regulates elections had to be open to all parties and nonpartisan. And that was the most surprising thing they said about U.S. elections for them. And, you know, most countries have technocratic experts who draw the boundaries for the districts. And we have that in some states, but in most states in this country, some state legislators draw the districts, and of course they bend them to their own advantage.
So does that mean gerrymandering, to pronounce it correctly, is an American-only phenomenon? Do most other democratic countries avoid that?
That's an excellent question, and I'm not an expert on that. And I wonder if there's any reference book that exists that explains how every single democratic country does that. There
Hmm.
sure ought to be a book like that, but I offhand don't know if there is such a book.
That would be a good dissertation topic.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting. So for your study of ballot access for alternative parties, sometimes what people do is they vary the strategy by state, but some parties will run independent under certain states versus running under a party line in other states. So do you think it's easier to run as independent or to run as an alternative party, or are they both very difficult?
Well, okay, here's the funny thing about the United States. The United States and Switzerland are the only two countries in the world where the ballot access laws for national office are not prepared by the national government.
Huh.
In the United States and Switzerland, every state writes its own ballot access laws, even for the presidential election. So what we have in the United States is they're all different. All 50
Oh,
states
okay.
are wildly different. And in some states, okay, the Supreme Court already said the minor party and independent candidate approaches to politics are entirely different, and therefore every state must have procedures for both. So that's the way it is. But in some states, irrationally, it's way harder to be an independent candidate than to be a new party.
Oh, wow.
Other states, it's the opposite. So naturally then, when somebody runs for president outside the major parties, he or she picks the easier method in each state. So that's why they always mix and match. They pick the easier method. So in some states, the independent method is easier and they use that. Here's the craziest one of all. Tennessee. In Tennessee, any independent candidate can get on the ballot with 25 signatures. But a new party needs 50,000 signatures. Well, naturally, every third party just runs their candidates as independent.
There you go, yeah.
But that means all the party labels in the ballot are, the Tennessee ballot always looks like this: Republican, Democrat, and then maybe 6 or 7 or 8 independents. So for voters, they don't know who these independents are. It may be really the Libertarian, really the Green, really the Constitution Party, but the ballot doesn't tell them that.
Yeah.
So
Unless they have a big
unfortunate.
name, that would be hard to find out. Yeah.
Yeah. And this year in North Carolina, all the independent presidential candidates are trying to start a party because it's 13,000 signatures for a party, but 85,000 for an independent.
Oh, wow,
So,
85,000.
nobody in their right mind is going to go out and get 85,000 signatures when they can start a party for 13,000.
Yeah. Yeah, that's got to be the highest I ever heard, 85,000 for an office.
Well, in California, there's 2 ways to get a new party on the ballot. You can have 75,000 people change their registration to show themselves members of a new party, or this is the craziest one of all. If you don't want to do that, you can get on that you need 1,300,000 signatures. That's 10% of the last vote cast for governor. And a few years ago, the legislature passed a bill lowering that to 3%, and our governor, Gavin Newsom, vetoed it. He said it would confuse the voters to have more parties on the ballot.
Probably not.
I'm sorry that he did that.
Yeah, yeah. So do you think ballot access reform works well with other types of electoral reform, like ranked choice voting or proportional representation, redistricting reform?
Well, those are all good things, but they're all separate things.
Okay, they're all separate.
It's hard enough to get any one reform through. It'd probably be even harder to have a bill passed that did all those things. But we have in 9 sessions of Congress, we've had bills to set a cap on how many signatures the states can require for federal office. Congressman John Conyers from Detroit introduced that for 3 sessions of Congress, and then Congressman Tim Penny from Minnesota introduced it, and then Ron Paul from Texas introduced it 4 times. But of course it never passed.
Oh no.
We might get a bill like that again next year. We're working on it.
Okay. So could you please tell our audience about your newsletter, your Ballot Access News?
Yeah, it's 40 years old.
Wow.
I'm getting tired and old. But anyway, it's still coming out. It's only $18 a year.
Oh
Anybody can
wow.
just Google Ballot Access News. And if you'd like to be a subscriber, that would really help me. And it's only $18 a year for 12 issues.
Okay.
So you can get what you need to know if you just Google Ballot Access News.
Okay, you said you've been doing it for 40 years. Wow.
Yep.
Is that a solo effort, or do you have people helping you out with that?
I have a co-editor now. He's helping me. He's younger than I am. Bill Redpath. He lives in Illinois. I live in San Francisco.
Interesting. So I take it that you're able to make it work well, that you're not in the same country with the editing and the idea exchange.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite get your last sentence. Say it again.
Oh, okay. I'm saying it sounds like you're able to make it work even though you're in different areas of the country. The editing and idea exchange.
Oh, right. Nowadays with modern technology, people can work from home, so it works fine. We just talk on the phone and use the computer.
Sure. So 40 years ago, that's almost as old as I am. So 40 years ago, it was 1985. Okay. So what did the newsletter look like then? Did you do it did you go to the copy shops and print it off that way, or how was it when you started out?
You're right. You got it. I would type it and take it to a photocopy shop and mail it out. So, yep, you got it. I started using a computer in 1986.
Oh, okay. So you went 1 year without using a computer?
Right, a typewriter.
Oh, wow. As long as I've been able to do work, I've had a computer with me. So I've heard that it was very difficult comparatively to what we do now when you didn't have the word processing programs to edit.
Yeah, and also back then, that was even before there were fax machines. So,
oh wow,
if a court decision came out and you were dying to read it, well, you just had to wait for it to come in the postal mail. So even faxes was a huge improvement. That started in the 1990s.
Oh yeah. So since you mentioned reading these court cases, the way I have found those is mostly through Google Scholar. So you say they come to you. Do you pay for a subscription to that, or how do you get them?
People can choose to either get the newsletter in the postal mail or to have an email sent to them with a PDF of the newsletter attached.
No, I'm talking about the court registers, the court opinions that you're talking about.
Oh, well, the courts generally put up their opinions on their own court webpage.
Oh, okay. So these days, the best way is you go to the whatever district it is in, and you get it through the web.
Yeah. The U.S. Court of Appeals, they always put up their opinions on their own court webpage. The U.S. District Courts don't necessarily. And the state courts, they vary. Okay.
So you used to have to request that they mail it to you?
Yes, I remember when we won a huge victory in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1983. They struck down early petition deadlines for independent presidential candidates. It was called Anderson versus Celebrezze. It was from Ohio. And I remember having to wait and wait for that dumb thing to come in the postal mail. I knew it had won from reading about it in the newspaper. the whole opinion, and I just had to be
sure.
patient.
Wow. Wow. So that sounds like in that time a lot has changed that way.
Sure has.
Richard, thank you for coming on the podcast and talking about all your experience and knowledge in this area that is of utmost importance to our audience.
Okay, I sure enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
I wish you all the best with your newsletter and everything else you do in life.
Okay, you too. Okay, bye.
Bye now.